Hello and welcome to another episode of the JRE Review. For this week, we got a great banging conversation for the owners of Joe Beef, which is Joe's favorite restaurant in Montreal, maybe favorite restaurant in the world. The guys that run this place, Fred Morin and David McMillan, fascinating guys. And this is on podcast 1202 for the, if you want to match it up to the podcasts of Joe Rogan. And really, for those of you that are new to this podcast, what I do is I discuss and comment and break down Joe Rogan's podcast for the week and talk about things that I liked about them. I'll have guests on. We talk about it. Sometimes guests have been really inspired by stuff Joe's done, and we get into the conversation. So anyway, back to the owners of Joe Beef. Joe's known them for some time. They are the James Beard Award nominated culinary adventurers. Can't read today. So they're fantastic chefs. They cook a lot of interesting meats and use a kind of old school French restaurant technique, which really sounds fantastic. Very cool stuff. I'd love to go up to Montreal and try them out. They have a new book out. The new book is not just about food, but also about their adventures and things that they are good at and things that they are really just fascinated by and into. They started off the podcast talking about how it's actually difficult to find the types of food that they like. You know, if they're down in New York City, it's kind of tough to find a good liver meal or a kidney meal, or maybe some more obscure game meat like rabbit, or even a place that serves horse. And he's saying in Canada, there's a lot more selections. You can find more obscure things. Or Montreal mushrooms as well, very expensive mushrooms, but there's something that they cook with quite often. And they had a lot of really cool historical facts too, just talking about how the population in New York City exploded. So back in the day, if you moved, turn of last century, if you moved to New York City, didn't have a job, what you could count on is, because of the river systems, there was a huge selection of option of oysters, a lot of oysters growing everywhere, keeping the rivers clean and just doing what they do. And you could go down to the dock area, the rivers, and just pick out 6 oysters and eat them. That's 6 grams of protein each, and 6 a day would keep a guy alive until you found a job and something else. So there was always kind of like this readily available food, and it's just a more cool, unknown, like little history fun fact about New York and how it got there. One thing that they were Googling, they got Jamie to Google, is that an oyster can filter 30 to 50 gallons of water a day, which is a shit ton. That's a lot of water, so it really keeps river systems clean by having oysters in there. And oysters, they're fucking delicious. They also talked about how many child labor laws in Canada were brought around because of the kids working in oyster shucking plants. There were so many kids in there, and they get injured, and these laws came into effect. Going back to their foods that they like, Joe talked about pizza combination that he loves, pineapple and anchovy pizza. When I first listened to this, I wanted to try it, so I actually got a Domino's the other night, and I tried it. It's bizarre, I'll tell you that much. It definitely isn't my favorite choice. It's like super salty and kind of strange, but try it out. Try it out, let me know what you think. It wasn't the worst pizza I've ever had, for sure. Then they started to talk about a little bit how they cook and how they get into cooking. So, for example, if you take some rabbit is very dry, very lean. So what they would do is they would kind of sew in some pork belly meat into very lean meat like rabbit, and this is kind of how these chefs cook a lot of cool game stuff. So if they have elk or other different types of meat like that are often very lean, they will cook in other types of animal and fat just to give some flavor and let it kind of marinate together. And that I found pretty cool. I'm not a huge cook myself. I cook pretty simple things, but it is cool to hear how these guys go about it. Both Fred and David have had pretty serious issues with drinking. They say drinking goes hand in hand with being a chef because you're a host. You know, you're around alcohol all the time. They're very open about this, and they're both not drinking now, and they talk about the many, many years that they've drank and how it became very depressing to them. And what's interesting is one of them still goes to wine tastings but spits everything out, which is kind of strange and probably not advisable for alcoholics. But if you have the willpower, give it a shot. I guess you'd still get the taste of it. Joe brought up the carnivore diet, the diet that a few people are trying, and Jordan Peterson and his daughter have had quite a lot of success from. And after they all talked, they at least with their own opinion and kind of agreed that it was a reduction issue more than the diet itself. So that diet works well for people because you're taking out a lot of the other food that maybe is giving you some sort of autoimmune issue, which is, you know, maybe part of it. These guys were also friends with Anthony Bourdain, and obviously they wanted to come on and talk a little bit about the tragedy of Anthony and his passing. And obviously Anthony really loved to travel and loved the feel and feel-good foods and all the rest of it. After Anthony's death, there was talk about who's going to take over, and there was some word that Gordon Ramsay might do a similar show, but there was a big outcry. People were not into that, and obviously they talk a little bit about Anthony's addiction problems. These guys knew him and knew that, and you know, they commiserate with it, and they know where the pain comes from, and obviously they have kind of similar stories in some way. So I think it's possible that these guys got inspired by him to clean up. And they do say that being sober and having control over addictions brings a lot of happiness. And they seem much happier now that they've struggled with that kind of part of their life. And then they talk a little bit about education, how in a way school doesn't prepare you to be a great chef because there's no straightforward path. You go to your career advisor, counselor, whatever. They're not going to end up saying you should be a chef. They're going to say you're an accountant or something else. And that was an interesting point because they talked about how in their restaurants they've got a lot of people kind of from broken homes and broken directions of careers. And Joe talks about how he probably had ADHD when he was in school, and it's a real thing, but it's not really a problem. It just means that you have a ton of energy and the classroom is fucking boring, which is hilarious because it probably is true. Like the fact that they take a bunch of kids and just sit you down and say, right, now learn this math, instead of really finding out what you'd enjoy. I mean, chefs, people that work at bars, they like fast-paced, moving things. That's what they've always wanted to do. Yet, for whatever reason, there's this period of time where we all have to just fucking sit down and that's it. Nuts. It really is nuts. A cool story that they had, both Fred and David were, they were reached out to by the Fertitta brothers, the guys that used to own the UFC. And they flew them out and said, hey, do you guys want to run my restaurant in my new big casino? A lot of money, a lot of seats, all this. And they knew they were kind of getting off to the wrong foot when both Fred and David suggested that, in fact, they would have a tiny little restaurant room. They'd rather do that with about 16 seats, make it super exclusive, cook everything kind of almost tableside in a lot of ways, and you know, have it in like a dingy little next to the laundry type spot in their hotel. And of course the Fertitta brothers were like, nah, I'm looking for someone that can really make us a lot of money. I appreciate it. They knew they weren't going in the same direction, but it led to an idea of theirs that they really want this like simple decor, amazing food, very exclusive, 16-seater kind of old school French restaurant. And when they were talking about it and kind of suggesting what it was and how it would work, I mean, to me it just sounded really cool. It sounded like an amazing place to get to go, and you know, also super, like, it's not really so much the exclusivity of it. It would just be the fact that you get them all to yourself for the food. You know, they get to tell you about how they came up with the recipes and get to spend some time with some real world-class chefs. would be such an amazing opportunity. And how Joe talks about Joe beef being as good as it is, I mean, Joe gets to eat at some amazing restaurants, so I imagine it's pretty unbelievable. But anyway, check these guys out. Check out their new book. It was an awesome conversation. If you're into food, you're going to love it. It's podcast 1202. And thanks for tuning in, guys. Really appreciate you. Peace.